Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I hope that you're having a lovely week. I know that you're very busy and that it's about that time where you begin to feel overwhelmed. Although many of you have probably taken your midterms, we've got spring break on the way. That should be nice. Very happy to see you today. As you know, we are discussing political parties. And this is the latest institution of democracy for us in a long sequence of institutions of democracy. And, you know, as always, we're going to be dealing with a set of questions that relates to why parties emerge, why they take on the characteristics that they take on. And in the case of political parties, we'll focus on the concept today of party system. And I want to address a set of questions that many of you might have and that maybe you've thought about before. And those questions are, why do some societies have many parties and others have few? Why do some societies have parties that break down along ethnic or religious or linguistic lines, while others have parties that break down on class lines or regional lines? Why is it that these sorts of systematic differences appear and then stay in place? And why, for example, does the US have only two parties? Why don't we have more parties to choose from? Why are we left with such unsatisfying parties? Many of you may be suspicious of the claim that parties are essential to democracy. If parties are so important, why isn't there a party for me? You might ask. Why is it that I have to choose between two very unsavory alternatives that really seem to be the same? These are all valid questions, and there are no easy answers. But what we'll do today and Friday is try to understand in a kind of rational sort of way why parties do and do not emerge and why some societies have more or fewer parties. And we'll be thinking about not just the demand for parties generated by the attributes and identity categories that characterize a society, but also the ways that institutions and electoral institutions mediate or kind of affect or filter that demand for parties. And in particular, we'll focus on the distinction between majoritarian and proportional institutions. So our starting point then is the concept of a party system. And a party system is basically just the set of political parties in a political system that interact in patterned ways or in orderly ways. And this implies that the system has at least two parties, because multiple means more than one, and it's not a system if it's just one party. So right away, we're sort of ruling out some of those one party states where there doesn't appear to be any competition. And then the patterns and the interactions among the parties suggest that there are some regularities in the distribution the parties show and the support that they get in particular elections and the support that they get over time. So this implies that there's a lot of continuity in the parties that form the system. And so we can study it that way and think about the party system as an institution of government, as an institution of democracy. So in Brazil, for example, there are many, many parties, and there's one government. It's a multi-party system, if ever there was one. The effective number of parties is like 5 or 6, and it's ordinarily been higher than that. In recent years, it's come down because the party system has begun to consolidate a great deal. But however you slice it, Brazil has a lot of parties. And you might ask, why is that the case? Well, there's a lot of diversity in Brazil. There's a lot of racial diversity and regional diversity. There is ethnic diversity. There is class diversity. There is all sorts of variation, and there's a lot of different demand for unique political parties to represent those different groups. But that's only half of the equation, because it's also important to know that Brazil has proportional electoral institutions, which means that there are multiple winners. And that means then that small parties have a much better shot at winning seats if they get some electoral support in an election. That means then that voters aren't just likely to demand a wide variety of parties, they're likely to vote for a wide variety of parties as well, because they know that the elections will produce multiple winners and that those small parties they support have a better shot at winning than if, say, the institutions were majoritarian and gave the whole constituency to a single winner. So we'll be unpacking both the electoral institutional component and the social demand component in this lecture. But this is one way for us to get started thinking about the different components of party system and why party systems emerge the way they do. On the other hand, the United States is clearly an example of a two-party system. And you might be thinking, well, wait, there's clearly a lot of social demand for unique parties in the United States. There are environmentalists, there are workers, there are capitalists, there are indigenous and Native Americans, there are all sorts of different types of groups who might have unique identities and attributes that could become important in politics. Why is it that we just have these two parties? Well, it's because that social demand for parties is tempered by our electoral institutions. So we have single member district plurality electoral institutions where there is a single winner, and the winner simply has to win a plurality of the votes. That means that they are very, very unproportional districts. Small parties are unlikely to win, so voters are unlikely to vote for them, and politicians are unlikely to form them. So as a consequence of our single member districts, that social demand for parties is not translated into numerous parties. It's instead translated into the two parties that are the most likely to win. All other parties essentially fade away. Now, of course, we do have other parties. There's the Green Party, there's the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. There are many, many parties, but the point is that those parties don't have a realistic chance of winning. They are not viable. They are not competitive parties. We have two parties that are realistic, viable competitors, and those are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So this portrait that we've painted so far emphasizes the social demand for parties that arises from the identities in the attributes in a society, and then the electoral institutions and the way that those temper the social demand for parties by creating incentives for or against voting for and creating small parties. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this piece by piece. And we'll start at the very, very beginning so that we can think about party systems and parties as institutions that result from choices made by individuals, and namely voters and politicians. And so our first step is asking that set of questions that I asked you at the start, which is, why are some party systems divided along ethnic lines? Why are some divided along class lines? Why are some divided along religious lines? Why are some divided along linguistic lines, regional lines, so on and so forth? Why do some systems have many parties and others have few? this question is a question about, well, the demand for parties, but also about the institutional context and the way that it filters or tempers the demand for parties and affects the choices of voters in politicians. We're starting with the individual, in particular, the voter. We're starting with you, in other words, you and I. And we're acknowledging from the start that individuals are multifaceted and we have many different attributes. You might be a worker, but you might also be a Catholic. You might also be well, what else could you be? Maybe you're a Spanish speaker. Maybe you're an English speaker and a Spanish speaker. Maybe you are a parent. Maybe you have other cultural characteristics that become attributes or part of your identity. And maybe all of these have some role to play, but all of them can take on different values and be important to you to differing degrees. And you ultimately are the one who chooses which category you place yourself in. Am I a worker? Am I a capitalist? Am I a Christian? Am I a Jewish person? What am I? What is my identity? And identity is constructed and chosen, and it's a place and a category that we put ourselves in. And so we socially construct them in that way. But all individuals in society do this. And so on an individual level, our first political decision is what identity category describes me and what attributes distinguish me, and how did they become connected to my political behavior, my partisan identification, my ideology, and so on and so forth. So consider some of these different attributes that might be associated with identity categories that could be connected to a party or some identity group. You might think about class, social class, like whether you're a worker or a capitalist. You might think of skin color and whether you're Black or white or brown. You might think about nationality and whether you're English or American or Guatemalan or Nigerian, El Salvadoran. You might think of profession. Maybe you're a political scientist like me, or a plumber or a doctor or a teacher. Maybe you are a postal worker. Maybe you're a garbage man. Maybe you're a mechanic. Maybe you are a secretary. Region, north, south, east, west. Maybe you live in a rural area and this is part of your identity. Maybe you live in a coastal or an urban area and you identify in this way. Maybe your origin and whether you're foreign or native, an immigrant or a native, maybe that matters to you and you identify in that way. Maybe you're tall or short and maybe that matters to you. These are all examples of individual attributes that could take on meaning or importance for someone and become politicized. But what it means for them to become politicized requires us to begin to consider the distribution and the frequency and the relative importance of individual attributes. And that's where we start to think about the aggregate in the big picture, the society as a whole. So let's take a hypothetical country, and you imagine that we can divide it by region, north, south. This is familiar to us because this is a division that's been drawn here in the United States. You can divide it by language as well. And say we divide it by French and Dutch. And the point that we want to establish is that in this hypothetical country, as in other hypothetical countries and in other countries, who you are becomes associated with both a region, north or south, and then language, French or Dutch. And we could just as easily replace these identity categories with others. They could be religious or class categories, region or origin, whatever. The point is that we can think about countries in terms of these categories and then think about how they begin to shape identity formation. The formation of identities is what will ultimately shape the formation of parties. And the ways that electoral institutions interact with the demand for parties will determine the number of parties in the system. And so then we have these hypothetical attributes. You can be a Northern French speaker, or you can be a Southern French speaker. You can be a Northern Dutch speaker, or you can be a Southern Dutch speaker, and so on and so forth. And so we've got both attributes as well as combinations of attributes. And this is where we begin to consider the concept or the notion of a cleavage and the ways that cleavages can be cross-cutting or reinforcing depending upon the circumstances in that country. So individual level attributes, how frequent they are and how numerous they are and the way they correlate and the way that they concentrate will shape actual identity categories. So in other words, the relative importance of different attributes will determine the actual categories that become politicized. And so what is salient in terms of identity will become salient politically. And so that might differ from country to country naturally. But if, for instance, the distinction between French and Dutch speakers is a key distinction between identity categories, well, those will become politicized. But we can furthermore say that a country with attributes or categories that are uncorrelated, that don't complement each other or run parallel, have cross-cutting cleavages. So Northern and Southern Dutch speakers, Northern and Southern French speakers. A country with cleavages or identity attributes that are running parallel or that are complementary has reinforcing cleavages. So Dutch Northerners, French Southerners. And then this distribution will determine which identity categories are activated. And this is a really important point. This is where we have to stop and emphasize what that means. When we say are activated, what do we mean? Who's doing the activating? Well, politicians, political entrepreneurs, people who want to form political parties. Remember that parties are groups of people who seek to win office and or support those who win office or seek to win office. And so parties form and politicians form them in response to the distribution of identity categories. Politicians are a lot like business owners. Business owners will only start a business if they're smart, if they've identified a demand, a need for that service or that good that is not being met. If there's no need or demand for that service or good, it doesn't make any sense to start that business. In the same sense, it doesn't make any sense to start a political party unless there is an identity category that is salient and that has not been activated. What does that mean? It means that politicians and parties will only concentrate their efforts where it's worthwhile, where they can activate some existing group or some social group with some set of attributes that helps them to self-construct an identity category. So take a look at an example of cross-cutting attributes or cross-cutting identity attributes. We've got, remember, 4 different types. We've got the Northern French speaker, the Southern French speaker, the Northern Dutch speaker, and the Southern Dutch speaker. And remember that we're talking about the frequency in the correlation, the salience, that is, of the different identity categories. How common or numerous they are in terms of people who fall in that category. In our hypothetical example, you can imagine that the population of the country is equally distributed in these 4 identity categories. French Northerners, French Southerners, Dutch Northerners, and Dutch Southerners are all equally well represented in terms of their demographic size as groups. They all represent 25% of the population. So another way to put this, from the vantage point of a politician or a political party, all of these different categories are equally activatable. All 4 of them are going to be equally responsive to activation. In other words, it makes sense to start a party to represent all 4 of these different groups. All 4 of these different groups could have its own party because there's a division between North and South. There's a division between French speaking and Dutch speaking. There's a division between French speaking Northerner and Dutch speaking Northerner. And there's a division between French speaking Southerner and Dutch speaking Northerner. So all 4 cleavages are equally well represented, and all 4 of them then are going to be equally activatable or likely to be activated by politicians and parties. That means then that parties are likely to emerge in all 4 categories and for all 4 categories. Now, I'm giving you another example of some hypothetical data. We're still using our same categories, Northern versus Southerner, French versus Dutch speaker. And what I have is I have some hypothetical distributions. What you're looking at is essentially the salience of these different identity categories. And looking at these identity categories and looking at these distributions, look at these through the lens of a politician in a political party or a potential political party or a political entrepreneur, someone who is considering starting up a party. Which identity categories should be activated? Tell me in a private message. Again, you are a party leader or the leader of a potential party. You are a politician. And you're looking at this. And the question is, where should we focus our efforts? Or where should we seek to activate people or supporters? I'm seeing a lot of consistency here, and I'm very happy with that. Keep them coming. Yes, yes. So as many of you are pointing out, actually, let me pause for just a moment and give anyone else a chance to continue commenting, because I do think this is worthwhile. But I will give you the answer here in a moment. Okay, so the categories that are likely to be activated are Northern Dutch speaker, representing 57% of the population, and then Southern French speaker representing 36% of the population. And it's relatively straightforward, right? These are the identity categories that are the largest, and they're quite large in relation to the other groups in those regions. And so it doesn't make any sense to start up a party devoted to Southern Dutch speakers, and it doesn't make much sense to start up a party devoted to Northern French speakers because they represent such small portions of the population. By contrast, French Southerners and Dutch Northerners represent most of the population. And so it makes sense to set up parties that represent those two groups. And of course, those parties will probably be at odds and will probably be in opposition to each other in terms of their interests, political, economic, possibly their social and their cultural ideas. And this is the kind of foundation for parties and why parties emerge and why they don't emerge to represent particular groups in society. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this is a simple hypothetical example. Any society is much, much more complex and diverse in terms of the various identity categories. There are whole sectors of society who are left behind, and especially in a majoritarian system where the electoral institutions penalize those small parties that might be capable of representing these smaller segments of society that are too small to represent a salient identity category to a potential politician. Jeffrey asks, since those two are the largest, would that lead to a majoritarian system with two parties? No. So the electoral institutions in the party system are separate. The demand for the parties does not then shape the electoral institutions. The electoral institutions we sort of understand as independent of the latent social demand for parties. And actually, Duverger's law, which is one of the few laws that we have in political science, says that the social demand for parties and the electoral institutions are independent of each other. And the institutions can be majoritarian or proportional, and it will be then the combination of the institutions and the social demand for parties that produces the actual number of parties. So in this case, Jeffrey, to answer your question, we could start with this latent social demand for parties, and then we can layer on top of it either proportional or majoritarian institutions. It wouldn't be either of those two that necessarily follows from this distribution. So the discussion we've been having has emphasized two factors: the social demand for parties that arises from those identity categories, and then the electoral institutions, the rules about how votes are translated into seats. And these two components have to be understood as part of an equation, because they work together to produce the number of parties. And the set of questions that we'll address now help us to get to this. And we're working backwards here, and we're working up to this eventual law that I've been discussing with you. And the questions that we'll address now are: when and why are some cultural differences perceived as politically and socially salient and others not? So in other words, if we have all of these differences in society, why don't corresponding parties exist for all of those groups? Why, if we have all these different social groups, why don't we have an equally abundant number of parties? And more specifically, when does the cultural difference matter, and when is it ignored? And the answer is, it has to do with the electoral institutions. And so we're going to put together the social demand for parties and the electoral institutions to try to understand why some differences become important and why others don't. So any society can be thought of in terms of those identity categories, right? Workers versus capitalists, um, social groups versus social groups, different linguistic groups, different religious groups, different confessional groups, and so on and so forth. These are all latent social cleavages. We call these cleavages because they're divisions, they're differences between people in society. And those latent social cleavages are the starting point because that's the social demand for parties. But the social demand is tempered by the electoral institutions, which intervene right here. And they come in between, and the electoral institutions determine which social cleavages become politicized. That is to say, which differences politicians and parties try to sort of exploit and kind of respond to and leverage for the purpose of creating a party and winning votes and winning office. And so it's the interaction between institutions and social cleavages that presents and produces the eventual party system, either more or fewer parties, like the example of Brazil and the example of the US that we saw. Now, electoral system, you know this concept already, but it's useful for us to review it. An electoral system is a set of laws that regulate electoral competition between candidates or parties or both. And the electoral system translates votes into seats, right? So the electoral system is that set of rules that determines whether or how many votes parties and candidates must receive in order to win representation in each given district. And we can distinguish between two relatively broad types of electoral institutions that we'll use to understand and analyze party systems and the number of parties. And so we know these already, and this is review, but this is useful for us because we'll be using these pretty extensively in the remainder of this lecture. A single member district plurality system, or a majoritarian type system, is one where individuals cast a single vote for a candidate in a single member district. And so you go to the polls, you've got one vote, you vote for one candidate, period. The winner of the most votes wins. And that's usually, by definition, a plurality. They need only win the most votes. And even if the second place candidate wins one less vote, all other candidates are eliminated and that winner takes the whole constituency. This is a single member district plurality system like we have in the United States. A proportional representation system, by contrast, is one that produces a proportional translation of votes into seats. This is generally one where voters cast multiple votes for candidates in multi-member districts, and the candidates with the most votes win. And the district magnitude can vary. Districts can be large or small, as small as 2 or as large as 150 or larger. There's no cap theoretically, but the point is that it produces a proportional translation and not a majoritarian translation. So we've got then these electoral institutions and these two types of electoral institutions, these two poles, if you will, majoritarian and proportional. And these electoral institutions have very, very different implications for how they affect the translation of social demand for parties into politicized cleavages. Now, the number of parties, in the question, why do some countries have parties that break down along these lines or those lines? This is really a question about the number of parties and why countries have the parties that they have, and why those parties have the qualitative character that they have. You know, why in the United States, why is there a two-party system and a center-right and a center-left party? You know, in European countries like the Netherlands, why do they have so many parties, and so on and so forth? The best answer that we have to this question is from Duverger's law, and it's a law. It is. It says that the number of parties is equal to m plus 1. And m is the district magnitude, or the number of the number of members in each district. And so if the M is 150, like in the Netherlands, the number of parties theoretically should be 151. But if the M is 1, like in the United States, the number of parties should be 2, because M plus 1 equals the number of parties. But let's break this down and understand how this actually works and why m plus 1 equals the number of parties, and how that became a law. So we've already established that social divisions are the main driving force behind party formation, and that the latent demand for parties is what drives politicians and political parties to take that initiative. But the electoral institutions, and specifically whether they are majoritarian or proportional, will shape how social divisions are turned into parties, and they will sort of mediate the relationship between latent social demand and politicized cleavages. Let's work this out and talk about how this works. So we know that the more social cleavages there are in a country, and the more these cleavages are cross-cutting, that is to say, the more identity categories there are, and the more these identity categories are cross-cutting, the greater the demand for distinctive representation, the greater the demand for distinctive political parties. In a country with many, many, many different groups like Ecuador or Peru, where you've got differences between ethnic groups, differences by region, differences by geography, differences by class, differences by language, on and on and on and on, differences by race, you should have extraordinary demand for distinctive representation. This latent social demand will provide an incentive for the formation of political parties. But that's not the whole equation. Those political parties might form, but the institutions themselves will play an important role in translating that demand into actual parties, competitive, viable parties. Before we get there, let me give you an example of the distribution of identity attributes in a hypothetical country that has a relatively complex set of social cleavages and cross-cutting set of social cleavages. In this hypothetical example, you could imagine that we've got a division between the rich and the poor, and a division between Catholic and Protestant. And that in this society, moreover, this division between Catholic and Protestant and rich and poor can be drawn both within those who are of European ethnicity and within those who are of indigenous ethnicity. In other words, what you have are 8 different distinctive social identity categories that together are 100% of the total population, but individually represent only 12.5% of the total population. This is a distribution that is relatively complex, and there's a relatively diverse demand for political parties. Now, if you look at another example with a less complex and a lower demand for social and distinctive representation, it would look something like this, where the individual categories are not equal, but instead the rich are all Catholic and the poor are all Protestant inside both the European and the indigenous population cohorts. What we would say is that country A generates more distinctive demand for representation because it has more social identity categories. Specifically, it has all categories. Country B generates less demand for distinctive representation because there are fewer cross-cutting cleavages, and therefore it generates less demand for distinctive representation. So you can see then that the frequency and the correlation of the attributes is what generates that distinctive demand. But it's the electoral institutions that determine whether that demand for representation actually leads to the creation of parties. So think about this in this way. In a non-proportional system, there's going to be less incentive for social cleavages to be translated into new parties, because only two parties are likely to win the race, or only two parties have a shot at winning the race realistically. In a more proportional race, there will be multiple winners. And so there are multiple parties who have a realistic chance of winning seats and getting into the legislature. So in this way, majoritarian, non-proportional electoral systems tend to work against the creation of new parties. And conversely, proportional electoral systems tend to facilitate and promote and foster the creation of new parties for the opposite reason. Now, let's think about this in a more mechanical way. There are two reasons that electoral institutions produce this effect. The first reason is what's called the mechanical effect. And this refers to the way that votes are translated into seats. And there's also the strategic effect. And this refers to the way that voters vote for the candidate who has the most realistic chance of winning. Electoral institutions, remember, create certain incentives. Voters respond to incentives, so do parties. And the rules of the game in creating these incentives that voters and parties respond to will affect and sort of mediate or temper the translation of latent demand for parties into actual effective parties. And it's through this mechanical effect and this strategic effect that takes place. So the mechanical effect works like this. In majoritarian systems, in single member district plurality systems like the United States and the UK, the mechanical effect punishes small parties and it rewards big parties. So notice, for example, that the best way to look at this is to think about the national totals in table 14.14 here down below. The winning party, the Conservative Party, won 42% of the votes, but it won 52% of the seats. Other parties, or the Liberal Democrats, for example, won 17% of the votes, but they only won 3% of the seats. And it's because in single member districts, only a single candidate wins. All the other candidates are eliminated, regardless of how many votes they received or what proportion of the vote they received. So all those votes are thrown out. And so it's possible for smaller parties to win pretty substantial shares of the vote in individual districts and get almost no seats at all because they don't win any individual districts. At the same time, it's possible for big parties to become overrepresented because they narrowly win district races and they only narrowly beat the second place party. And so in the end, they end up getting a larger share of the seats than they actually received in the votes because of those close margins of victory. This is the mechanical effect. The mechanical effect punishes small parties. And the reason is because, again, it has to do with the disproportionality of the electoral system and the fact that small parties won't win a share of the seats proportional to the share of the vote that they received overall. Now, the strategic effect is similar, and it relates to how votes are translated into seats, and specifically the way that that influences the behavior of voters and political elites. So when electoral systems are disproportional, their mechanical effect rewards those large parties, and it punishes those small parties like we saw. But that means then that voters are going to respond accordingly, and they're going to vote strategically. And therefore, they're going to primarily vote for those big parties who have a realistic chance of winning. They won't vote for those small parties that don't have a realistic chance of winning. Similarly, the political elites, the politicians themselves, they're going to more carefully choose which parties they run with. And they won't run with small parties. Instead, they'll run with large parties, because it's only those large parties that voters are likely to vote for. And what this means then is that both the voters and the politicians behave strategically in a way that works against the formation of competitive third parties or small parties. So strategic voting means voting for your most preferred candidate who has a realistic chance of winning. Strategic entry refers to politicians' decision regarding whether to enter politics under the label of their most preferred party or to enter under their most preferred party that has a shot at winning. And so, this is a problem that many of you, I'm sure, have thought about from time to time. Why is it that there are no Jill Steins who run with the Democratic Party? Well, because Jill Stein has to moderate her beliefs and her views and her policy agenda substantially to win and to run with the Democratic Party. At the same time, those Jill Steins who choose to run with the Green Party and choose not to moderate or water down their initial views are less likely to win because of strategic voting and because of the way in which voters will vote for large parties, even if they favor the Green Party, because they know that the large parties have a more likely shot at actually winning office. So even if we start at a place where there's an extraordinary demand for distinctive representation, the electoral institutions can work against that demand for distinctive parties by creating incentives for voters and for parties to engage in strategic voting or strategic entry. We'll continue this discussion on Friday, everybody. We're not done yet. We have more to talk about here. But this is the continuation of our coverage of political parties and party systems as institutions. And we'll talk about this more on Friday, and we'll also step back to think about what kind of a perspective this is and what institutionalism this fits with. But thank you very much for being here, everybody, and I'll see you on Friday.
Bye, Professor.
Thanks, everybody.